Okay, so I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the Contemplative Science Center and the East Asia Center and the Tibet Center to today's dialogue. And if you're interested in the Contemplative Science Center activity, then uvacontemplation.org. You can sign up for its mailing list for getting announcements about this and other types of events, and you can do the same for searching on East Asia Center UVA or Tibet Center UVA. My name is David Germano, and I'm the director of the Contemplative Science Center as well as the director of the Tibet Center. And so I'm going to be giving an introduction as well as being the interlocutor in terms of the conversation tonight with Khenpo Tsultrim Lodro, who I have the great pleasure to introduce. And the translation will be done by Catherine Hardy, who is finishing up her doctorate at Oxford and who actually has done her PhD or is doing her PhD on Tibetan and Chinese relationships over religious issues and focus on the monastic community that Khenpo Tsultrim Lodro heads. So we're very grateful to her to be here and act as that intermediary. So in way of introduction, it's a very personal visit for me because I first met Khenpo Tsultrim Lodro when we were both in our late 20s or maybe mid to late 20s, and we had the same Tibetan teacher. And that teacher, whose name was Khenpo Jigme Punso, went to an empty valley in 1980. An empty valley in rural Tibet. When you say rural Tibet, that's really rural. It's not like rural Virginia. It's way out there. And this was up in the grasslands, and it was a valley that was empty because it was empty. It wasn't empty because a monastery had been destroyed or there was something going on there in the past. It was just an empty valley. That was one he had his own reasons for going to. And since 1980 to the present, it has grown to an institution of learning, of Tibetan learning, that is perhaps the same or larger than the University of Virginia. A massive infrastructure and a massive number of people, especially monks and nuns, but also a number of lay people and a lot of Chinese people, and as you can see from myself and Catherine, also a number of European, American, Australian, you'll notice as soon as she talks, Australian people also coming there to learn and to study. And it's a distinctively Tibetan place. It's a densely Tibetan place. It's a monastic university in the best possible sense of the word, where they study a broad variety of traditional forms of knowledge, and it's become the largest Tibetan Buddhist community in the world for sure, and certainly one of the largest Buddhist monasteries in the world today. And Khenpo Tsultrim Lodro has been a monk since 1984, when he was 22 years old. And I think he has certainly emerged as one of the greatest religious figures in Tibet today, who is renowned on multiple fronts. On the one hand, he has emerged as perhaps the dominant ethical voice amongst Tibetan religious leaders in Tibet itself. It's hard to say he's the founder of the vegetarian movement in Tibet, but he's certainly its most prominent spokesperson. And for those of you who think, well, so what? Aren't all Tibetans vegetarian? No, not even close. It's a meat eater's paradise, as I like to say. It certainly was not a vegetarian's paradise. And so the movement for taking traditional Buddhist values and ethical principles and establishing this vegetarian movement and animals' rights movement has really been an extraordinary process over the last 3 decades that Khenpo Tsultrim Lodro has been at the center of. He's also one of the great traditional intellects in Tibet, who's kind of authored through audio-video recordings as well as books, a broad variety of traditional commentaries on Buddhist scholastic knowledge on an immense, diverse array of subjects. He's also a very prominent contemplative himself in his own practice and in his teaching. And finally, he's a social innovator. The monastery itself is essentially a social enterprise of extraordinary character that's involved in a broad variety of activities, not only traditional, but also getting into lay communities and acting as an ethical voice, but also spurring specific kinds of initiatives, offering services of a variety of kinds, community libraries and school systems and artisan training systems and so forth. And so Khenpo's leadership, as well as the community overall, has exemplified the idea that the life of the contemplative and the life of those who are engaged in social innovation out in society, in secular and lay society, that these two things can coexist in extraordinarily profound ways. And I remember when I first met him, it was a little bit odd because he asked me something about, actually this was maybe a little bit later, but he was asking me, what am I doing now? And I said, I'm at the University of Virginia, I'm a teacher there. And he goes, Virginia? And you have to realize, again, rural Tibet, grasslands, nobody was speaking English for many, many kilometers. And so I thought, what are you going to do with Virginia? I mean, what does that mean to you? And he starts rummaging around his books, and he pulls out a book by a professor from the University of Virginia in Chinese translation, namely Ian Stevenson, since passed away, who was the world's foremost authority on doing research on reincarnational past life memories from our UVA medical school. And so he had read that book and immediately recognized Virginia as the home base. And on this trip also, where we've been going around and talking to a broad variety of UVA professors and researchers, we went over to the astronomy department to talk to one of our most well-known astrophysicists who has written a book on Buddhism and science. And as we were talking, and he was kind of grilling him about exotic dark matter and all these things he'd been reading about in Chinese translation, and as we were leaving, he noticed a copy of his book, which was called The Quantum and the Lotus in Chinese translation, and realized that he had also read that back in his monastery in Tibet. So this is someone who has been not only an extraordinarily learned person in traditional Buddhist and Tibetan subject matters, but also someone with an avid interest in other fields of knowledge and thinking about how these things coincide as the world changes all around us. And I think one of the great values of having him here today is that he's not one of these Tibetan teachers who is packaged for our consumption. This is the first time he's ever been in the U.S., and certainly he's had a lot of interface with Chinese and so forth over the years, but he represents a different world, because the world of Tibetan Buddhism, even today, is very different from the world we have here. And of course, as we bring these ideas into a university setting in any kind of subject matter, we package them for the consumption of our students and our public and so forth. But I thought what would be really valuable today would be to have a dialogue where you had a visceral sense of what it feels like to move from that traditional Buddhist world of learning and contemplation to this new world that we've been creating around us in America, where we think about contemplation drawn from religious sources, Catholicism or Buddhism or Native American sources or whatever it might be, Islam, and begin to adapt them for completely new settings that don't have a religious context or a religious set of values associated with them. And this is a very difficult process. And what we're going to do today is begin by talking a bit more about that traditional Buddhist world, the world in which he grew up and was educated and was formed, and how they think about contemplation, how they learn it, what the different varieties are, and then slowly begin to talk about how that's changing in contemporary time, ending up where we are today, which is contemplation being taken and adapted in a broad variety of forms in public school systems and universities and healthcare systems, business training, and so forth, and what some of the opportunities and challenges are in that movement. So please join me in welcoming Khenpo Tsultrim Lodro. So the monastery, like the university in North America, is an institution of higher learning, and it has an organization to it. And so tell us a little bit about those monks and nuns who are actively engaged in learning programs. What is the nature of those institutions at your monastery at Larungar, Monastery Nunnery?
Ni larungan gnana tini jomo tang lama cho kutso shidang tini shawalega chizilega yo lobjong katola ina nyamnung katola.
That's tini teranga cho samandana yongni tini chatla nyamba thomar kwatan chijigins.
First of all, just like to say good evening and Dashi Deli to everybody here who's come to the conversation tonight.
Tini Virginia lotala tini nga shetang gapuyo tini terang musindana yongni tini chatushi ji yongi korko zambo shongala nga pegayos.
And Khenpo has had a very, very good impression of the University of Virginia and is so glad to have the chance to actually be here in person tonight and have this chance to share his thoughts with you all.
Yeah. teni Virginia lobtala gawi jimsang kang rezina teni khorang ga jimjik she ate ji chachang jikting chachang zgla jimjik she ngd ma to shuk chigla jimjik she md teng yak bori sang ko yos.
And the reason for Khenpo's very favorable impression of the University of Virginia has been its multifaceted research agenda. So the fact that it undertakes researches in all areas and not just necessarily focused on one.
Nga chu mzewan tani ngubo kyangwa mares tani ngubo da tani namshi nika ga zhibi tani nika le zhiba zre ma to jibu mares.
The human is not just material or materiality. It's a combination of the material and consciousness.
Tani nga chu mogo ngubo lipola mola ina mogo ngubo lipo kyangwa la tani jimjik she ba dang tani min chwa ina ngubo chwa kyangba la jimjik she na dang zhe man du.
So for that reason, it's not okay if we just research the physicality of the body or the physicality of the material world.
Tani ngarang cho zhibcha ga chashi zu ngubore da chashi zu semre tani semyina sem khorang da tani sem khorang ga tani chwa tani gala jimjukche ya de halipa kar chimbore sam ga dus.
So in addition to the research on the physical nature of things, since we're comprised of both a material component and the component of our mind or consciousness, it's very important that we also do research on the latter.
Tani ngarang cho mostigla sanlo tang ba na ngarang cho chechok de gangle jang kar chewares.
So in terms of us, in terms of humans, our vital life force, or what makes us human, our soul or our consciousness is of utmost importance.
Tani ende Virginia lota tani mi chechok la tani jimjik she de tani mi semkhang la jimjik she de me te pe yang bore sam ga yos.
So the fact that scholars and students at University of Virginia research, in fact, the human consciousness and the human mind, psychology, is a very wonderful thing.
Tani shogni ka de la jimjik she na tani ta zo tani nga chu mogon do bat khangwa ta tani dethang gangoni yarjin ro thap jire sam gandus.
And by combining a research approach that looks at both the physical and material and one that looks at psychology and more intangible aspects of the mind, we can develop a really healthy direction in terms of our academic research institutions.
And this
is the reason that I have a very good impression of the University of Virginia.
Tani dari kongkatini zhewa wanda shina nga cho tani boka wanda shina lurji tola tana gomba zina lobta chimbo zina chigri jamba yo marais.
And in relation to David's question about the role of monasteries as universities, Khenpo says that in terms of traditional Tibetan history, the monastery was in fact the university. There was no other university aside from the monastery.
Teni tatanda boina teni nga chola shusoko tola teni lobta ta teni gomba zini teni ni teni yoris.
But in contemporary Tibet, obviously, there are now secular institutions of higher learning in addition to traditional monasteries.
And in
the secular institutions of higher learning, subjects are offered like maths and various branches of science.
Chuluk korata, tani storjing ringneta, tandite lojong shake yores.
Whereas in the monasteries, the topics of study are religious topics and traditional Tibetan sciences.
Tani gombaga loso zayate korang tani loso malak chatsangazris.
The educational system in monasteries is a comprehensive and complete educational system.
Teni gombaga teni malak loso malak tinangla penanga chummoga teni samba kandi shego moga shiga kandi shego teni moga kanlongda kanshut so to kandi shego mayakbo kandi shego de korang cho gombaga loso nani yongo yores.
And in terms of Tibetan ideas about human morality and conduct, character, how to be a good person. These ideas are derived from the monastery.
Tani shizuko tokoloso tinang tani korang tani gormon soya tani chowa ganti shigo the tinang ni yong yores.
Whereas in the secular institutions of higher learning, people are really learning about how to make money and how to make livelihoods.
Tani pok chorjing gerne samlo wang shina shetang mogon chowa kirgo ore tani chowa te yang ubo te yang hachang karchiware te daily jang karchiwa te tangbo mo yakbo chigo ore samne korang so te sam go yores.
In terms of the traditional Tibetan education, whilst it's acknowledged that people need to have a livelihood and that they need, material component to their existence, being a good person precedes these in importance.
Tani mayak pozerate tani janla nopa making kanda tani janla phamba shinkan tani zla zegres.
And so this notion of being a good person entails not doing harm to others and doing acts of benefit to others.
Tani ngaso tani boba tani gombati so nani par lobketi lobso nandong ko so te teres.
And so the education that monasteries deliver primarily revolves around this.
Tani ngaso garla yena tani korang so te tani mamangbo yore mamangbo chama te so te ko so shawa ni le yore chite lojong chi kita re tani chite so so nyamlin chi kita re tani tithola tani lekani le yores.
And in terms of Larunga, the monks and nuns, the residents there, the monastic residents there, pursue two streams of work or endeavour. The first being study or academic study, and the second being practice or meditation practice.
Tani nyamlin ze atinangla, the lojong da nyamlin ze kitinangla, so soranga tani the sem yakbochia da mozang bochia the chigri. Tani ni tani ta shuzokotola japshia manamla pampadria.
And within this notion of practice, there are two parts. The first being the cultivation of one's mind, and the second being service to society.
So, I can't help but respond partially to how he characterized universities. So, I just wanted to say in response to that, does he really think that universities are primarily about making money and livelihood? Because that's not how we think of universities. So.
Da Khenpo Tiezongda di Shitsoke, the Shitsoke Lodro Chimunano, so the Nitso and Gumuzo Yadikolare. Da ding also Nupshuk Samno Tang Jung Kakare, Natsuka Samno, the Nita Lodro Chimuka, the Nuba, the Nita Draminaso Yore, the Niki di Don Nguma, the Nikaka Lobja, the Gumuzo Yamato, the Nita Pindashan Bayos.
So there is certain Pambashamba Yorit.
Mainly it's about making money and one's livelihood. It's not to say there aren't any other benefits, but...
Yeah.
Oh, Khenpo thinks that this is because this is primarily what the Western value of is in universities.
Well, since this isn't primarily a discussion about Western universities, I'll let that one pass. But we might come back to that. So, can you tell us, so what are the specialized organizational structures to correspond to those two types of activities? So some people are there to engage in academic study, and others are there to engage in, as you described it, a type of practice, both contemplative practice, as well as practice that helps you be of more service to society. So are there organizational structures that relate to that? For example, at the university here, we have 11 schools. And those schools cater different kinds of subject matters. So how is that organizationally expressed in the monastery and nunnery?
Yeah, Talarunga Kanala di da Lopjung Jutang di Nyamlang Juti Muksaga dini da Drumshita Malagayo.
Yes. Theories, so Nala Teni Kanigo Yoris, the Kani Nani Mangchishuta, Teni Lojong Shinkan, Teni. Dinani chashi chigdo teni da parchi teni yacha sumchin rabo teni zito teni to nyamlin shinkanis.
Yes, there are. Of the students at La Ronga, approximately 70%, the majority, pursue the academic route, and the other 30% follow the route of practice.
Now, could you tell us how many years people would study if they were to do the full curriculum in the academic college, and how many years they would study if they did the full curriculum in the meditative college? And also, do people typically do both, or is it kind of either or?
다 되니 시드라나나 죽나 되니 로카츠 정고 되니 죽라나나 죽가 로카츠 장고 되니 무카시디 냠디 되니 시드라 죽죽자 되니 냠디 죽긴
샤다나라 로종시나 되니 로종 야보즈 코랑가 되니 당보 로름 당보니 되니 지거바르데 야보즈 차상즈 로종시나 로종하고 그랬어.
In terms of the academic path, if one was to pursue the full course from the first year until the end of the program, it would take 15 years.
되니 접장나라 되니 냠린 신킨트 소나라이나 되니 또 고소 양 당보니 또 타마 파트 양보즈 되니 탈시나 되니 로들라 되니 되니 너제고리스 곰고리스 곰제타 곰 잡제타 되니 곰 잡서 로종시지니까레 데로 던고리스.
And for those who are following the path of practice, a full course would take 7 years, and those 7 years would entail learning about meditation techniques and also meditational practice.
되니 로던가나라 되니 다 코랑 곰드티나라 직종으로 말했다. 얘나 다 코랑 곰스르티 로던가나라 하고로 그랬더니 냠뇽 갈라강 첨스 되니 코랑 요온로 그랬더니 대요송디 되니 로던가 질라 되니 코랑 사자잠 바자 손에 몬터니 곰잡나 파치르 되니 코랑 곰스르신로 그랬다.
And in terms of meditational practice, those 7 years are really for enabling students to gain an understanding of meditational methods and techniques. So it's assumed that within that time that they'll have a very thorough overview of meditational techniques. And during this time, we'll also have been able to gain experience in meditation too, but the idea is that upon conclusion of the 7 years that they'll then be able to go on and pursue their practice beyond wherever they go after those 7 years.
And then the issue about how are the two related to each other? Is it more like some people do a bachelor's and do a master's and PhD, or are these really more like vocational schools for the meditation people, and this is more like going to college?
다 디니디 시드단 죽자바 그저디 치무스레 다 무카시나 디 베나디 다 치즈그 고름레 되니 무카시 되니 시드단 죽자 니가 되니 장게요 되니
니가진 그냥 요리나 만본 말했을 때니 파치와도 때니 호종 친근도 호종 지그래 때니 곰잠근도 파치 때니 호종 시상나라 만본 로 말해 때니 호종 친근도 소고 조월 호종 친근 시그래 나한테 곰잡적나라 조르다이나 코티 조르다 보시그래.
In general, people follow one or the other of these paths. There are very few people who are doing both, or who formally take studies in both the academic path and the practice path. So in general, those who are doing meditational studies, they do not tend to take part in many academic classes. For those who are pursuing the academic path, they may do meditation on the side of their academic studies, but they're not formally enrolled in the meditation program.
So having spent a lot of time with both types of people in Tibet, I know from experience Okay, so we'll try to speak up a little bit, since Aaron said there were some problems hearing us. I certainly have no problem projecting my voice, so we'll see how you do. So my question is, having spent a lot of time with both meditators and people who've gone through 15 years, by the way, that's what he said, 15 years of academic study in order to get a monastic degree. I know that both sides can sometimes be a little less respectful of each other than you might hope. So, for example, the meditators will call the ones who do philosophical study Gyalwa, which means just kind of useless intellectuals, more or less. And then the ones who do the academic study will often call the meditators like mi shempa, it's like ignorant. So I'm wondering, and of course there's also examples of people who blend both and a lot of respect for both sides. But I wonder, what percentage of those would he say that actually go through the academic college really develop a deep contemplative personal practice?
Through the college, the academic path.
And, not that they learn it in the college, but just along the way, as they said.
Teni David Kozina Nangyun Teni Burkin Nongden Teni Lojukanala, Dakotso, Teni Lopchon Tola, Teni Shutchibu, Teni Japkan Kotso, Teni Gumrukan, Teni Pensun Kotso Yapo, Samsaina, Teni Kotso Pensun, Teni Zikut and Kuship Sheki Yomare Kashizina, Teni Kotso Lopchon Sheken Kotso Toka was re, Teni Kotso Drup, Teni Gumrup, Japkan Kotso, Teni Rigne members re. Teni larunga ina ti kutso rikni kaloma waka teni drewa tang samso chimuzure. Teni ti member teni da tieke samna larunga nang teni larunga junkin kaloma so kutso lupchong ti korum chutu muni gum kenyamlen teni chutsu topu topkin mambo ayos.
Maranso lo jibji manchula teni yanchula sonsarti teni korang teni Chabata, Zombata, Koto Jikanganala and Rogo Mare, Lojiji Yanchunindi, Tini, Gum Tata Shiki raising as Sherdanga Gala, Jig Mambo Tragiorita, Koran Jikanala and Rogo Maris.
Okay. So to start with, Khenpo is starting by saying that for those who come to Larunga when if they are 40 years old or above, then they're not required to take part in any formal classes, so no academic classes. There are a lot of examinations at Larunga. That's a big component of the academic studies, and those who come to Larunga who are age 40 or above are not required to take part in any exams or any formal academic classes. Whereas those who are younger, particularly in their 20s, then they tend to really be doing academic study, following the study path, and they are not doing much meditation practice.
Teni ngaranso pena nangba tin nangla teni lojongche mambo de tinala chaparta chamara bo chamarik ba rawina ripa halipa teni de ripa tangzapo ta teni ripa chawu jipu teni je de tena ngaso bok torjela yinda manda loni sarnga manchula teni lojongche torgos ni teni je gores.
In terms of studies of subjects like logic, which require a great deal of erudition and sharpness in the mind, the Tibetan tradition holds that it's necessary for students who want to study these things to do so before they're age 25. I suppose the assumption being that the brain's capacity weans off after this.
Teni bokawanda shena teni lonish tsanga yanchuni teni the Samaribatu Jana did the Shichi song, the Yabushito Mares, because the Sangres.
Yes, thinking that after 25 one really can't get really good results in one's study of these subjects.
The Lonish Sanga and Chorti, the new Tsumambo Lolanzayata, the new Rupa Mambo was Ranga Samlota, Soba Yavutu Sama, Lonish Sanga Yanchuni, it is Marjanto on those.
Before one is 25, the ability to memorize a great deal of information, to, I suppose, spin the cogs of your brain rather quickly, to debate, all of these sorts of things are considered to be one's capacities are at their sharpest, whereas after age 25, the decline begins.
Teni lo nyeshe na lo ta jwanga chitu yanchu ta teni nyeshe na manchu tela koso lojong do zo she kare gom gyap ki tela koso halepan thongchin moch she kmaduse.
So for younger students in their mid-teens to really about their mid-20s, their main pursuit is academic study, and they don't really do much meditation practice at all.
Teni nga so garanda boy na yang tere teni lo simchi la toni simchi ni jipche go par teni zla yang lo jong yang che gomya jab kare ni ka te che ndus.
And at Larunga, students who are around the age of 30, sort of say in 30s towards 40, they're expected to do both study and meditation practice.
Teni lo jipche yang chen ni teni koso lo jong mambo che go mdu zo to gom jab kun ndus.
And after age 40, then not much academic study. The main thing is meditation practice.
The yin de mang chi shu de teni je ma to ba yang khashi chong chong ko ka se teni lo jang ap chi tu kam ni gom tak jam kan da tani yang khashi lo ngap chi tu chi re na ta long lo jong mambo shin ke de yores.
Of course, there are exceptions to the general rule. There are some people who start to learn meditation at a very young age, 15 or age 16. And there are also some people who at age 50 and 60 are still reading books.
Well, there's hope for all of us. So I'd like to just briefly go through the 7 years. So the 15 years of the academic college, we're going to skip for sure. But the 7 years of the meditation college, if we could just briefly go through those 7 and talk about what the practice is, but also in kind of non-traditional terms, what he thinks is the benefit of that practice. I mean, he's been asking all week long people in the nursing school and education, business, and so forth, why do you do that meditative practice? What's the benefit of it? And so we want to turn the table and ask him this time, what's the benefit of that practice? And let's start with the first year. Okay. And the first year is called the Ordinary Preliminary Practices, and it's a set of narrative, analytical meditations on Buddhist philosophy.
Teni Khenpo trupchak kanala teni kyundung lo dunyore teni lo thambo ina di ngonjo ke teni thumung ngonjo re teni kheti di thumung ngonjo teni ta penyun zo teni taptepo ke gone teni ngojo shego na chi
teni ga zo chu na la ina teni manji ta halepa teni karchimbola teni zndo teni na ngonjo zena Shetang nga so ramba julu ko wang de na pe na ngondro zia ta lop chung go ni ta ta teni loje ta lop chung go ni lop chan ta tin dizri goram thomong go wang de na re de ina karchi chung go wang de na te pe haliba karchim boz la tsang dus.
In terms of religious practice, the foundations are considered extremely important. So the first year of the preliminary practice is essentially the base of practice that goes up in graduated levels beyond this. It can be considered, I suppose, in analogy to a school system as grade 1 or the very first year, but in terms of its importance, it's vitally important for everything that's going to come after that.
Ngatu gum jav na yang ja teni nomban don na yang ja teni shisu ko tola shawa ya pole na yang ja teni to so samala muir jamada mambore siti muir jamada mambore tena khashok jamada mambo lamkhan jamada mambore tena teni chorang chu jebi ner kam na lamkha kanglan rote teni hondo te teni ta go re hondo te lamkha kanglan ro ta ja ore ta hondo te ngoni transition gadi khangkhor ta ore se fang pa.
So really, of the many kinds of practices we can undertake, meditation or recitation, positive, meritorious acts in society, there are many motivations or reasons for which we can do these things. So really the key function or purpose of the preliminaries, the first year of the common preliminary practices, is to determine the direction that one's future meditation or religious practice is going to take. It's setting the right direction or the accurate direction for one's practice after this. So Khenpo said that we can look upon the preliminary practices as the steering wheel that's going to take us on further in our meditation or practice careers.
Teni perna ngaso jirni gomba ta chi bola samlo tamba ina jirni gomba te teni shirko gomya ga jirni to chi pa ina teni tela yang khorang ga teni lamkha mangbo 다 그런 거 제부터 mambo즈레지 배나가서 전에도 겁나 소소 내값스 되는 가서 샘거 논식 매반라오다 되니 소소랑라 생수 용화야 가서 신린지 당세요 된진자 보고 돈라 검지양 도지 되니 때 마임 받으니 가서 타르와 도바가 치했더니 검지양 등 된지인디 코솔라 되니 검대식이 나더니 코 쇼강 그 쇼도 무일강라 검 때라 하장갈 심보리티 무일 때때 코 람카 강란조도 되니 혼로
Meditational practices can be put to a number of different goals. For example, shamatha practice can be used to quieten one's mind, to reduce one's stress, etc. For a variety of what Khenpo refers to as chicken soup for the soul purposes. Alternatively, or at the same time, it can form a part of our practice towards ultimate enlightenment. So really the direction to which we are going to orient our practice activities is really determined by the foundation and the direction that we set during our preliminary practice.
딘리니 가서 람카티 스므레지 람카 스므도스 당아서 추나 람카 스므도 람카 찍데 소소 첸디 토라이나 쳄시마이나 데니 데모체 보용야당 첸데당 쳄시마라 데니 소소곤 초와 데모체 보용야 데니 셈컴 데모체 보용야 즈포 데모체 보용야 데디즈 그 돈달라데니 곰제 찍는도스 데 찍으리스 데니 니파데 데니 소소랑 미 게르크 데니다 제와 가와 나와 치와 등월 38 매바시네 나랑 랑티니 다 기가나치 등월 매바텐디스 제가 연산비 텐디 뭐이라 니바데리스 데니 뭐이르 심바테니 당에 심진 30볼라데니 데 판독고 연 심진 30볼라네 로바제겐 디돈데 데니 곰고 연산네 데니 삼고레 데니 데스 람카 강란조 데니 몬조 탁자고레 데니 몬조다 할레바 데니 까침보레스
Traditionally, the different paths that religious practice can be oriented towards are conceived as three. The first being one's worldly happiness and well-being, prosperity, etc., not only in this life but also in future lives to come. The second path being one's own liberation from suffering, the suffering of samsaric existence, and then the third path being the elimination of suffering for all beings.
Okay, so the first set of preliminary practices then he largely described as motivational in character, that it's reflecting upon your motivation, your intention, and how this is going to shape other practices that you engage in. And so the actual practices are like these guided reflections upon impermanence and suffering and one's agency and so forth. The second year, people then go on with that as a background to do what are called the extraordinary preliminary practices. And the extraordinary preliminary practices are quite different. And so I wonder if you could explain to us a little bit. I'm asking a very specific question. So you do these practices 100,000 times for each one. 5 different practices, each one done 100,000 times. And the first two involve visualizing what they call an assembly tree, where all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and teachers and so forth of your lineage are visualized in front of you, and you prostrate while reciting a prayer. And the first 100,000 times, the prayer is basically saying, I go for refuge, or I join this community in the Buddha, his community, his teaching. And the second 100,000 you do by generating this third motivation he talked about to benefit all living beings. You say a 4-line prayer that represents that aspiration, you prostrate, and you visualize that. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about having a year where people spend doing that kind of activity, visualizing Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and teachers in his or her lineage and so forth. What does that do to a person's mind? Not so much the traditional explanation, but what would a year of doing that? Like if we spend a year just visualizing, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, or whoever, the people that make up our heritage, that's some people's heritage, others would have other figures, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, whoever. What does that do to someone's mind? What's the benefit of that?
Teni di monro ke loren ni banang la di tomo mai mongom jo se yo. Ta ti nang la teni di capsule tang tini ta simge ke kum yore ta ti tini te nang na ta nga cho ran su jut ke lama tang chang su sem ba sangye la tini so de she gore tini yurin bo yang ne yang de te mo ke kum yap na penyun zo wo jire ran ke sim na la ran ki jut na la chi ke penyun re
tini nga cho lo tangbo to tini char song wi jini tini lo ni pa na te la tini ngonro re tini ngonro ni pa de tini ngonro ni pa ti na la gom ya ti la zo to ka gom go de na korang ga gom go tini he xin zina zo ngo ma ra wo to zo to shang shi ko sem gom ya re te she tang nga yo re nga ga na ni chi to tini shang shi ko sem re do de zo ngo ma ra wo re.
So after the first year of the preliminaries are completed and we move on to the second stage, there are 5 practices among the extraordinary preliminaries, but the core of them, the pith of these practices, is really the cultivation of bodhicitta.
Tini tinani tari nga soperna tini lama mambo tini ta sangji shakya tabani tawar tini mambo tini yung yore teso la soran debjita te gubati kangrezena pena tini sangji shakya tabada tini sangji tini ta song nang tini khorang sangji tini toba zena kondo sangji yishi zhihui te pena nga so tini chimjut zena kondo shuiku chimjut tabazres tani nga tini ti parna tini lama mambo yo pati tini chimjut ko tini kwandao zena kondo tenra bazres tani nga chu ta musim ria yong khen ga lama de tini nga chu chimna yong khen ga de che shui long tho ta tenris.
So in terms of visualizing the various lamas from our lineage, stretching back to the Sakyamuni Buddha himself, the reason that we do this is it connects us like a pipe from the reservoir of the Buddha's wisdom, which is like a reservoir. The lamas that have successively, generation after generation, taken place since then are like the pipe itself, and then our own lama that we have the fortune of encountering in this life is like the faucet to this wisdom.
Yana nga chu tini sangji shakya tapa tini sangji tini yishi sangji tini toba sangji yishi te pe na nga chu lok ko tini lok khang ta ba fa dian chang ta ba zhe tani ta lama ti wa na mambo zo ji de tini nga chu lok ko ba ta ba zhe tani nga chu tam je wa nga chu rang ga lama de tani lok ko tini de lok dong ma ro ter tang phao ta ter res.
Or we could understand it using the metaphor of a power station, where the Buddha's original realization is the power station, and then the lamas or the teachers, the realized ones who have occurred since then, are like the wire, and then our own lama is like the light bulb that sheds light in the room that we're in.
Then chimzo kana ga chita yongona tini nga tini di chig rugad mena tini yong tab ko mares tini lokang ga nang ga lot tini nga cho sa yongona tini kbad mena yong tab ko mares.
If we don't have, for example, the pipe to transfer the water from the reservoir, or the wire to transfer the electricity from the power station, then neither the water or the electricity will be able to reach us.
Tini di nani tini nga chu sora de tamni tini shena tini sora de tamna tini di nipa de tini ta nanglyang zena shoko nipa shinlup zena lama shinlup sangji ge shinlup zewa de yingjing wo man nipa zeres nanglyang zena shoko to tini chimzo ka nani sar yone tini nga chu zer yong gona tini de yong che ge jimsen de tini nga chu tini de kusola soran de tini ta ta shi ke da soran de chu thoni shana tini zeres.
So one of the reasons that we visualize and supplicate these gurus of the past is that their blessing, the blessing that we receive from them by doing this, is a kind of power or energy.
Tani jambachik tani kangrezena nga chu sangge tani song to so tamche po tani tarta guachuta tanchuta teni mambu yore nga so yaigi yore inji yore boy yore mambu yore ta yena teni te nga so susu rang teni tana teni ti nane teni changma de tonda chama da nga so shitop ko mares.
Another reason is that even though we have access to the teachings of the Buddha and commentaries on his teachings available in Tibetan, in Chinese, in many languages, reading them ourselves, we won't necessarily arrive at a complete understanding of their meaning.
Pena nga so teni lobda chimo teni ta lobde bi na teni girgun ko marchik teni pena chirik ta o na teni chirik girgun ka sha gore ma to ba chirik girgun mena teni loma rang ta na teni ha go maris karti te ha ko na lobda chimo na yong go mare gormoti de mambo jen go maris.
So it's the same as a university. If one didn't need a teacher, then one wouldn't need to come to university in the first place and pay the tuition fees. One would be able to look at a maths textbook and understand it without the instruction of a teacher. So it's really the same logic that obtains in the case of the Buddhist tradition, the Tibetan Buddhist tradition.
Teni to so teni ta nangdun teni ko yakbo lengo na teni nga so teni lama kongma to so teni reshe jab te jerja ka thoni ko len ni teni ti thola teni ranya ko tang zapo lengo na zapo len thna ti thola lengo re te manjit go re jit go re ti ko so ngama kan dishayo na tela samlo tang go re.
So what we need to do is contemplate and use the teachings of past masters as the foundation upon which we do our own studies.
Teni na America la teni yang teni chuluk yang teni chuluk ba na la teni zenkhen yosare se pena nga so lama go mare nga so sanje ga song la ta ni nyamlin che ge zenkhen teni yosare se yena teni shirtang teni korang ga sanje ga song la ta ni teni nyamlin che na yang teni chok re te sanje ga song thamche tsa ha ko na ko ta ko mare.
In America, there are some people who say that it's not necessary to have a teacher, that one can read the Buddha's teachings oneself and put them into practice based on one's own understanding. Khenpo says that in general, of course, one can do that. It's possible to read them and practice them, but in terms of understanding, obtaining a complete understanding, a thorough understanding of the Buddha's teachings, it's not possible to do so by oneself.
Tindi yendi tini nga so pena lobjag na ni girgun da hajang tini karchimbo yimba jinda tini nga so chug na la tini lamate hajang karchimbo zgres.
So as a teacher or a professor is considered important in the school or university system, so is a lama or guru considered vital to the Tibetan Buddhist tradition.
Tini yorang so pena tini Hawaii nanja Columbia nanda tini pena Virginia nanda so tini zambalang ka thola tini to katok chanda shichin changa tini lobta rindu bi jimsang to jamba khangba chimbo yo ba ta nyamang bo yo bi jimsang ko mare ta tina la girgin yak bo yo bi jimsang gres.
So the reason that people aspire to go to famous and influential universities in the world like Harvard and Columbia and the University of Virginia is not because there are a lot of people and they have beautiful buildings, it's because they have a reputation for excellent teachers.
Teni girgin yak bo yo na teni loma yak bo yo thap gore teni nga so the lama de pe teni karchimbo lan jok pi jimsang de teres.
Because the quality of a teacher determines the quality of a student, this is the reason that the role of Lama is so esteemed in the Tibetan tradition.
Ina Lama latini koranga tini charge 标准的 charge 的还种忙不要的，我就没是那的呢，可Lama因在那Lama因出是没是因那Lama去出。Then you marriage, Konala charges you, the reason Lama in the chose, or then the reason Lama in the chose charges yours.
However, there is a standard, or there's a standard for defining who is a qualified teacher, who is a qualified Lama. In general, the term Lama is kind of used very loosely, and people of different calibers are all referred to as Lamas, but in the Tibetan tradition there's criterion by which a qualified teacher is held and assessed.
Then sosorang lojong yabo machine kanda sosorang nyamlin yabo machine kanda the soga then parak then kolama yin then parlo tushina ti shi chokomari zanga namba nala.
So in the Buddhist tradition, a person who is not who hasn't reached excellence in their studies or excellence in their practice cannot be considered a qualified teacher.
대표는 가서 길근 소자친 보고나라 길근시구나 코로나 길근 거더니 황익드메나 길근시 맞춰봐당 더니 가서 더니 만칸가나라 만바시구나 더니 코로나 만바 거더니 더더니 황익드메나 더니 나발라 나타 맞춰봐다 더니 집안롤 집바레스.
So it's the same as how we wouldn't recognize a doctor that didn't have their, their proper certifications, or a teacher who didn't have the proper certifications to teach. It's the same kind of logic.
Teni tang asopena lama go me ngarang chorang gadini chulojong chegen zea te countries rezena ngarang girgun go me ngarang lota chimbo ngarang rang gandong ge zea ta yana ngarang pamba go me ngarang rang gamanyu ni za ge zea ta ten da bozres.
So saying that we don't need a lama, we can practice by ourselves, is the same as saying I don't need a doctor, I'm just going to self-medicate, or I don't need a teacher, I'm going to teach everything to myself.
Yeah. So if we go back to the issue of the contemplation and why you visualize these people in front of you as you do these prayers to say, I want to be part of this bigger community of trust, I want to essentially develop this motivation to benefit others and so forth. What I heard in there, just analyzing it from a more university point of view, let's say, then I hear two things that I think we spend a lot of time talking about. One is that by visualizing this tradition, this heritage, these heroes and heroines of your own cultural past and so forth, that on the one hand it encourages an openness to tradition. It places a value to say, this tradition may constrain me in some other ways, but it also gives me a place. It opens up a set of knowledge and so forth. And the second thing is it opens us and makes us receptive to the value in the forms of relationships that we have with teachers and so forth. These are things that are very familiar to us. We don't necessarily do that visualization practice every day, but these are topics that we talk about and think about a lot in America. And I have a very specific question about how someone who recently visited us, an American scholar and meditation teacher, who interpreted this practice in a little bit different way, and I wonder how he would think about that. The way that he interpreted it as, it's not just the fact that these are opening us up to teachers or opening us up to tradition, but that the people that you're imagining in front of you, they're not LeBron James or other kinds of figures, they're very specific figures who have an ethical relationship to the person that they're looking at. Because as you're involved with this practice and you're visualizing these figures in front of you, you're also imagining that they incarnate this deep values of compassion and kindness. And when they look at you, they're looking at you with this unqualified care, this unqualified compassion. And his feeling was that the more that he tried to think about what would be a secular analog to this, that he felt it was about imagining people that you had some experience with who had cared for you, who had exhibited deep compassion and kindness for you. And that for you to give that kind of gaze and that kind of care to other people, you first had to experience it yourself. And so by going back to your parents or a teacher or a friend or others that had given you that kind of unqualified compassion and care, that you could then begin to inculcate those values in yourself and exercise that towards other people. So it'd be a third interpretation of this simple one practice. And I wonder what he thinks about that interpretation.
Yeah. Then David zena de ransoso deni jutkala deni so whatever deni kutso ari kegin Dzongsar University Virginia la yongni deni ko drishi shilik shimbaji yore ko kusana ena da ransoso jutkala deni so tipikas yangne yangdi deni so tipikas di rang di chizre di lama deni re ransoso ninje ke koni deni rangni la thongdi rang ninje deni sortup kere 코츠크 뇽지 데니 츠르타피치스 랑 소소라 데니 양 뇽지 게토케레 양 데니 심라 데니 뇽지 게토케레 데모즈 그 제시실레 데니 체크 데니 제시실레디 삼소치모스
셰탕아초 곰갸비네 컴나 데니 베나가초 데니 란다 티리즈 곰나 데니 하디 데니 nga당 데니 nga초 심신 탐주 볼라 데니 하장 냥지와 데니 몽당스나 연신 하장 냥지와 데니 더 ngaso somala tayo samne tindi gumgo re tindi gumna tindi sosorang gella tindi nyangji ke ala yang panto yore tindi sina machoki yoji mares.
Khenpo thinks that in general, when we are meditating on a particular deity, for example, we visualize that the deity is looking at us with great compassion, looking on us with great compassion, and as a result, we are able to generate compassion in our own minds. He finds this explanation that you offered just now, acceptable.
I'll convey that. Yeah.
Yena daron tela tez dogse tinala yena tinga chu gum sarwa zoya da oteso tola ngarang la tini tasar jongziyos.
But Khenpo has some opinions in relation to the invention of new meditational practices in this regard.
Yeah. Perna nafshogla tini manzowi nerkamna tini zgar bogo tola jimjing mambo shini tama ngama thakchone tini ta mandan thongna pansareze zgzna pailao shu aya tini korang tini jini tini otan de mandan thongna chokoreze ne tini thakchu chegres nafshogla namang manzona.
In terms of the manufacturing of pharmaceutical drugs in the West, there's a very strict and onerous process of researching the effect of drugs, for example, on guinea pigs, etc. And it's only when the safety or the specific benefit of the drug in question is ascertained that it is considered safe for consumption.
Tindi gum tini ta sarwa tini zona tambo ranit gumni rang ranit tini ta zgarbo rabushini ta chorta mambushi gures.
So if we're going to develop new meditational techniques, then one has to essentially treat oneself as a guinea pig and do experiments on oneself for a very, very long time.
Tini soso rang tola tini chortapshi jimjukshi tini gumdala tini payun panba yo nopa me tini tepe tini tachubazi shisona tini tazu jambala gumzina ti chokres.
Only after having done very thorough and long experiment and research on oneself with a new meditational practice and ascertaining that the meditation practice in question has benefit and no harm is one in a position to be able to then teach that to another.
Tini karte soso rang tini gum jamni nyamnyung mambo da tini te nyamnyung tang zapo da tini yakbo soso nyamnyung sangmena tini gum jamra ta lamna yang nirkab pantok ta boyo na yang tartila country re hako mares.
However, without this process of long-term research and experimentation, then even though it may seem that there is some short-term benefit in a particular new kind of meditation practice, it's difficult to say what the long-term effects or side effects of this practice might be.
Yina nga zo nirkabsa nga zo per na tini ta sem ga nang nonshik me pan ra oda tinri ga tong la ta te zo tinri shini ta gumna te la no pa chimbo yoji mares.
In general, though, if a meditational practice, if we use it for the temporary relief of stress or pressure of something, then generally speaking, this is something that wouldn't carry much harm.
So I have a question for him. In the history of Tibetan Buddhism, there have been a lot of disagreements about what meditative traditions are beneficial, which are not beneficial, and those disagreements continue until about a minute ago. So, given that, I wonder what he would say if the University of Virginia did really rigorous 10-year study of the impact of certain meditative practices done in his monastery and came back to him and said, well, actually, those aren't so useful. And that we've shown through analysis of people's brains and stress levels and behavioral patterns and so forth, that other meditation practice from that other community is actually a bit more useful for your monks and nuns. What would he do in that context?
Pojin nang the logic nang la teni gom tap mendrawa teni chiz ga panyo yo teni panyo yu tang meta ti thola teni zopa mombo yo Teni kete kozo da larunga ka deni komthap University of Virginia kanala kozo ditola tseni piki kone teni shipju shipmu shini di yumbu shini teni kozo kidrebu ina oda komthap di penyun chebu yomares demuzo ka shilu yena teni kozo ditanyandu teni yana teni trupta shimbu ka komthap dile yasare yana kozo rangsoso saru shebi komthap dile yasare kozo demuzo ka teni da zomji yena teni chepechi
Dini kosa shimju mampo jene da drupje pe selfo dini gyayik panga par gyur dini kyan gyayik chatsang lotuk gyure ra.
Shetang atso boba nangla dini jimta tso nangla dini jo dini zoba jawayan da dini mambo yores.
In the Tibetan tradition, there is a lot of debate between the different traditions and schools, the lineages.
대 짐직 쉐일다 다니 소소 게르거드니 삼로탄 둘이스 카우스제 게르거드니 삼로탄 거드니 베 탑시 약보즈레스
In terms of this being an exercise of one's independent capacity for critical thinking, this is a good thing.
이나 데니 더디 조바 망치슈도 송아서 점타가 돌아 따스르 건담라 mambo 레스 레마토바 굼무니 타니 냠링 오마티 돌아 조바 mambo요 마레스
Whilst there's a lot of debate and different opinions in terms of, the view or arguments, I suppose, around the theory, in terms of the actual concrete practices, however, there isn't as much or isn't so much debate.
캬버드니 가서 베나 너쇼코드니 로브자침보나라 굼나 망칸가나 굼나 소토데 망지거드니 굼도 소코로아데리 망지 코로아데리 자비드니 지 주지번데 망지 코로아데리 데라다 In
terms of the meditational practices that are being brought into Western institutions like schools and hospitals and places like that these days, these are in terms of the Buddhist tradition, fairly basic and foundational practices, and so there's not really much debate about these or sense that they may be in some way harmful.
Teni yinna teni ta danga so teni yang lama kongma mambo yang mambo teni nguni tane ge nyamnyung jan ta so kongso ta yong na shetang teni ta gum jap chri na ta so to lam khipa mambo on ram da ta sr jam re ma to ba nguni rang ge nyamlin che jong na ta so to la khapar chimbo chi ji yo ma re si
So whilst there is in the Tibetan tradition a lot of discussion and debate and different opinions about theoretical questions or about questions of view, etc., or minute questions, in terms of the actual content of meditational practice, there is less debate.
Tindi ngama tini gomto so chama tini ta boba tini te nangla yo pat so na pe jagar ni mar yo mangchi shu de tindi yen song di tini mambo tini ta gom jam nyam nyong sak tindi shini tini shongbaz re ta sola tini chu nekap ka chu tasran ramara te ma to ba zawi thoni tindi norwa chimbo rin ro ji da tindi chimbo yo mare so gom yakbo shina so mashini nangdun mashina tini jamba nyenkhan ra tindi yo re ma to ba so nangdun de yakbo shi so na Since most
of the meditational traditions that are in the Tibetan tradition come from India, with the exception of some, I suppose, additions or debates in the Tibetan tradition concerning, view and things like this, the content is pretty safe, and that a person who knows the content of the meditational practices and knows the theory behind them won't be in a position of risk.
Nyamnyung jan so yang chama o chabrmendu ndi chibare kan shinang zhigndug zin de tindi shabayang yang boba chu na la haliba mangboris.
So in the Tibetan tradition, scholars have a lot of hair splitting over different theoretical questions, but in terms of those who are mainly committed to practice, they generally have a more open acceptance of the way that things are described and don't necessarily insist upon one definition of something at the expense of another.
Still, he didn't actually quite answer the question.
Shall we push it again?
So, yes, I'll push it again.
Okay.
So let's say that we did a study, and it was a very rigorous study that shows green visualizations really have certain kinds of positive impacts for people living in high altitude environments. And if you do black visualizations, then it tends to encourage depressive behavior, even though you and I are quite happy. But so that's a little bit of a silly analogy, but let's say they did that. Would he then consider maybe encouraging more green deity visualization instead of black deity visualization? Or experiment with it, play around with it.
연기하되 곧소 University of Virginia 나라 되니 체인직밖에 고네 대 십주 하종 체인직부터 tum비고니 십주 시니 되니 곧소 다똑 가독 장국을 돌아 공부하여나 대 묵석 되니 사토크 묵석 펜토 요리 대 곧소 십주 되니 십주 그 드레모 데모즈 톱나 되니 디타냠데 다 가독 장국 다 뉴스 되니 디 돌아 공부하나 대 곧소 버강진 되니 사토크 무리라 되니 묵석 펜토즈 요나 곧소 데모즈 되니 십주 랍시시에 톱나 되니 가독 낙복 돌아 되니 공부하나 되니 Penati toxa que ne mombo toya down deni nupa chepos a yena that demos que dribble the moose the chisa the tsenri petan tumbe que dribbles the demos shungna deni kete demos que dribble yena cheto larunga kanala ni tok jango yana deni hlat jango que gom jemondo deni gapki ei
yeah that's been sem de la nipan jamara mambo yore na mambo yore tani ngacho nangba nangla tini te khorang tini gomthab ज thone sem ग nipate khaifa jena ko wa to shekyo re te khasang mare tin ramra mambo yona chokores
in general
gos yes yona chokores tini yona chokore tini yona ngacho sem je atela nipan ramra mambo yores tini ti nipata tini te thunjit jena 야 khai 내가 좀 남바거든이 뜻이 어쨌든 쇼치그리스 근데 베나 교수가 된디즈 다 짐직즈 시장나야 초거리스 된디즈 니바된디즈 사바즈더니 베나 유니버시티 버지니아 있는다 야나 잠바즈 있는다 된디즈 그 거랑 그 검잡네 다른 데라 니바 잠바즈 등지 된디 사르 된디즈 요잖아 파민즈나 된디 요잖아 대 초거리스
so the capacities of the mind are myriad, and it is I suppose the purposes to which Buddhist meditation techniques are applied in terms of generating or opening up or stimulating certain capacities or potentialities in the mind are only but some of the various potentialities of the mind. So if, for example, it were found that green had meditating on or visualizing the color green had certain results, whereas black had other results, then there's no reason for this to be, this necessarily to be denied. The various effects that meditation could have on the mind, and the mind's potentialities are very many, doesn't have too much disagreement.
Teni yensona teni ngacho teni gomte yar chemanro orizina yante khorang ti niba dilata go orezi pena niba dilata khorang reu dilata na pena khorang teni goms sarwaz teni sarg teni yaboz teni raksona teni tim reu to teni khorang gumkhinzgina teni ngacho sama teni kelendro orezi ngacho sama to gom jab gorezi ta ina teni ta pena chipena ngacho teni yam 보그 추냠리 신게 된자지나요 다 코랑라 차창지 요래더니 코랑거 조 코랑거 뭐 이런 거마다 코랑더니 상지한다 딘디즈레도 데라 코랑 탑시 차창지 요래 딘디나 코랑라더니 잠바디 케 코랑라 엉코몽코 고마르 마도 바시다 코랑라 팀 제부터 콜라 판통 건지기나 그 인담만다 켈랭 그래지
So if, however, in terms of whether or not these findings would mean more practice on this kind of colour for the monks and nuns at Larongga, if it were, it would depend on the what the function or what the result of this meditation or practice would be. And if it would be beneficial in nature, then sure, it would be no problem for people to put it into practice. However, having said that, in general, for Buddhist practitioners, their ultimate goal is the achievement of Buddhahood. And in respect of this goal, there is already a complete set of graduated or practices to do this. So, yes.
Now, I've been keeping an eye on the clock, and we do want to leave time for questions. We could go on like this for many hours. So, but just to briefly allude to the rest of the 7-year curriculum, that we're still on the 2nd year. So the 3rd year is what is called deity yoga practices, where you do these visualizations of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and so forth, and you perform and recite their mantras. And the 4th one is the year where you spend on kind of interoceptive practices inside the body, or more like what we think of as yoga here in the US as well, but also doing visualizations in the body. The 5th year is on kind of concentrative practices or open awareness practices. And the 6th year then kind of continues that, letting go of objects of focus and concentration. And finally, the 7th year involves a lot of spontaneous visionary practices. So that's kind of a look at the 7-year curriculum that we're talking about. And maybe what we should do now is just, because we have already gotten a little bit into issues, I'll ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience, and we'll be available until 7. So maybe my final question is, against that background of so many different kinds of Buddhist meditative practices of very different types, and he has been in the US now for the past month or so, and for the past week he's been talking to people at the University of Virginia who are taking these practices, some drawn from Buddhism, some drawn from other religious traditions, and changing them in order to bring them into a public setting where it's not appropriate to have religious values like an assembly tree of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, or a Christian prayer that you slowly intone to create a contemplative state of minds. And so I'm wondering, what are his thoughts about both the future of his own people, Tibetan people, many of whom are lay who do not do these practices, who are never going to be part of the monastery or the nunnery. And he's been talking to us about the potential value of this for patients or undergraduates or 6-year-old kids in a public elementary school. What does he think about this movement? And also, what does he think about its potential value back in Tibet?
Yeah, the Khenpo, the University of Virginia, the Yongni, the Kutsu Gigin and Shipshu can gum tap the cola, the Shipshu can get in the Mombo Capta Shepare, namely Capta Shepare, the Kutsu to the gum top, the Chuluk, the Tibetan Buddhist with the Chashi Mebesoni, the Chuluk gum tap, the Yanam Lopta Canala, the Peshitamare, Yana, the Chisare, the Monkan Canala, Peshitangares. The indeed, the Kutsu. 다 갈라갔은 데니 곰탑 그 돌아데니 사도 데니 시tam 시기 요레스 데니 메몬부까지 딜라오야 다티 인디데 메몬불라 펜토 요레 네발라 펜토 요레 로말라 펜토 요레 데니 부중송솔라양 펜토 요레 다디 데모스크 아리키네즈지레 데니 따따 호크시 솔라다나 보미 몬부 다 검톱 데니 자원에 겹기요 말에 그저 자원에 시기요 말에 그저 시당 그 데니 미kia 포모이는 자 그저 곰바나나만 중큰 그저 곰그 소진 당 저거 제보요 말에 데니 아리 다 당상 그 데니 다 럽저 능 데니 멍강능 야 데니 체크던디 아리키네즈 당 보크 데니 시솔라 저거 에요 데니 몸베 보크 시솔 네즈 데니 유토 숑게 에인스
샤당아서 곰 잡세야테 로아 미르즈인 살티테 스당 스즈인나 데니타 아르인나다 보바인나다 데니 출글라 타바 용켄즈나다 멘켄즈나다 샤당 참아 곰테 잡고는도스
In terms of meditational practice, anybody, by virtue of the fact of them being human, regardless of whether they're Tibetan or they're Westerner, whether they're people with a religious faith or people without religious faith. These are all things that people everywhere should engage in.
penangatsodeni lipoteni ta jongder tonde teni chamadeni lipo jongder shisa khambanalando chenchen fangja khambanalando ni jongder jamda cheada yangna teni ngatso to shilola teni to chama jigni teni jongder shianda lipola jongder ngatso halepa chama teni karchimbulan jangndus.
So in terms of physical exercise, whether that be in a gym or jogging outside, these are things that most people consider very important and very legitimate.
Yeah. Tani simla te dang chikbari jongder te indamada gores.
And the mind is of equal importance. People should absolutely engage in training it.
Tindi insarti taba yona chokore taba mena chokore to taba yona korang taba yopi tini gum tindi jabji yore taba mena korang taba mepa ga thoni gum jabna ya tini jabji yores.
So it doesn't matter if a person has religious faith or doesn't have religious faith. If they are of a particular faith, then they can engage in a meditation technique which involves or incorporates elements particular to that faith. And if they don't have a particular faith, then they can engage in a meditational practice that doesn't incorporate religious aspects.
Penatini namba nala tini ta gum jablu halipa mambo tini yore teona ti nane tini gum jab serte so tini korang tapa gone tini gum jabna tini korang chure ndores tini korang tapa mepa zak gone tapa menken zak tini ti nane yang kashi tini tapa menken so korang gumna chokore ti gumna korang semna panto counter yogore.
So in the Buddhist tradition, there are a great variety of meditational methods. And if one engages in them with a religious faith, then one is doing so as a religious practitioner and is doing so with religious objectives in mind. However, one could similarly engage in these methods without any particular religious faith. In any case, engaging in these methods would be of benefit to a person's mind.
Same gatola teni to kongcho kevine kamna teni kongcho de teni chunzum shiala teni namba nangla teni halepa ga thapsi teni mangpondu teni tenra boyna teni tapa yonkan zgo gomna chokore tapa menkan zgo gomna chokore changma ga sis go gomna teni jewo tak chik bares tenra boyna jewo chik bares.
So in the Buddhist tradition, there are a lot of meditation techniques for dealing with anger, the arousing of anger and controlling anger. Anyone can do these practices. It doesn't matter whether they have faith or not, and the result is the same for everyone. It's of equal benefit.
Tini yang ina ti nala tini jirchu tis be na America ta wala tini ta mo tini taba menken tini zko tini gom gona teni tela teni penanga su namba nala yo ba teni chikpa chikyang su shini gomna yang tezi yang kapkas jang tanglin shi thap matab teni yojiri tena jirchu sawi thola teni nopa mepa shini teni kala kansam ko jirchu jamna tela na gayo mares.
So in terms of America, if people without Buddhist faith are taking on or engaging in Buddhist meditational practices, then it may be necessary to do some level of modification to the practices. It might not be possible for them without faith to engage in the full host of meditational practices that require some aspect of faith. In general, if these modifications are done in a suitable way that doesn't lead to any harm taking place, then this is okay.
Teni tirmni shi tachik bandi nala thondi teni nga so teni ta nufshogre ta sharshogla yang teni gosom gudu mambuz gum guthola to na shegdus.
So in the 21st century, it's not just people in the West, but also people in Asia too who are paying a great deal of attention to meditation.
Teni tirb jorge pa chirg pa tirb nish pa tut tesola teni nga so nam ga teni gum guthola teni so mang chi shuti gum guthola to na shi mand so nga so lipo ga teni ndopa ta kaya tena zaje ta gyonji ta teni guthola teni samlo tane teni titola pamjur guthola ndang mambo jawaris.
Whereas in bygone centuries, the past 200 years, people have tended to pay more attention to the needs of the body and material needs, food, clothing, etc., and have not been as concerned with meditation.
Then tirip joji babchir gabati samlo to sunalanga to norwa samlo mambo yores.
And the materialist preoccupations of the 18th and 19th centuries are something that we now realize to have been mistaken.
Tin norwa samlo te kang reason nga so ti kapse te nga so pamjur yo jana tele jamba chi go manduk sambi samlo to mambo zala yores ma chama da marita ma mambo da khabar de ti mate so ma shikin yong kan ga shiso ko tola shikin chenpo yong kan ga ma tin mambo zala pamjur yo na dan gre sambi tin ga samlo to ma mambo zala ndusi.
Many people during these centuries, or up until the 21st century, particularly influential people in society, advocated the idea that economic progress is all we need, or economic progress is essentially the main thing.
This samloti tinenga so zambalang ka sharta nab chamala shikin pe chimbo thep songs.
And the influence of this kind of ideology was extremely great all over the world, in the East as well as the West.
Then it is samlo norate conditions on the Natsu samlo de yard Natsu samle de yons marman baris, but changshoes. Mun matapi jimson girendos.
And the reason that this ideology is in fact, or was in fact, mistaken is that it was a very immature ideology.
Then it tirab nishipagan jigta, then it tirab nishipagan nala tundi. Then nga so sita on the or tarong ten regime and nga so liboga zbo teni gungkhoto teni kantavna manzu the shitavna tarong nga so sem guteni gungkhoto kang matavna darim and samni dam chama te shigayores.
But then starting in the 20th century, people started to gain the realization that fulfilling one's physical needs without paying attention to the needs of one's psychological well-being is not what's the word? Sensible.
Teni chamaga teni ta nga so gom jab jiti thola teni ta chi chamaga thongshin she yori yobi gemsen te teni nga so sem ga thola dungar mambo shongja wa ta nonshig mambo shongja wa ta teni nga so sem ga thola teni markiba mambo shongja bi gemsen jires.
And the reason that these days people are paying a lot of attention to meditation is that we really have incurred a lot of suffering. We've incurred a lot of stress and a lot of pressure in our lives. And for this reason, people are really becoming very interested in meditation.
Tani zambalang nufsho ko tani yargi song tsari yarkabta tani tani shigbu so o ta gurmoyo na te pamjor yargi song na tarong deskit Kebo yung mandu tarong gum jab go ndu sam tindi samsong de tani nga so harsho ko mambo zuke o ta gum zi to go ji zin sare sam ni tindi sam go randang ta wala gerwan ro yores.
So as a result of affluent people in developed Western nations realizing that having fulfilled their economic needs or their material needs, they're still not feeling happy, they're still suffering. This realization has had a great impact on people in the East who look to the West and think, oh, well, if rich and affluent people over there think this way, it must be right.
Yena mambo tano yichi yo marze o tada ingi mare nga so pamjuri yargi sona gormo yo na karim market kebo yung gore samne tano yo tindi changzen tawam changzen shinka yang mambo yores.
Yet there is still a great number of people who don't accept this at all and think that how could it be that if we won't be happy if we have a lot of money? The acceptance of the idea that material progress may not be everything is not all pervasive by any means.
Sherdanga so muzerwati chindizrezina teni sherdanga so muzerwati teni te shir chokchak re teni chokchak yan sarti chokchak samje po teni sani chikbanda wondusi.
So in general, when we understand what it means to be human, we can understand it from the point of view of humans being animals and animals all being sharing a similar characteristic. The the first thing that humans, like animals, need to do is find food when their stomachs are hungry.
Teni pho jakchari jis ta zo teni mambo samlo tang gares.
And then after they've filled their stomachs, then they can start to think about all manner of other things.
Teni te ina teni chu bok teni to nga so bok teni yang saja te yang te yang chu musar ta res.
But in this respect, the Tibetan tradition or Tibet is a little bit different.
Teni countries res na shertang rentang ka tawa wan de sina korang so teni pho ma jak ng ma yang teni mambo yo re ta korang so gom jab go re ta mari sina korang so go re samni teni samlo go thoni tawa go thoni teni sam go yo res.
And different because even though there are or have been a lot of people who have been materially speaking not very well off, maybe still hungry, etc., they've nevertheless recognized the importance of meditation. However, in terms of actual practice, it wasn't the case that every single person in society were meditation practitioners.
The
main people who engaged in meditational practice were those monks and lamas who tended to congregate in monasteries.
Jasha Gyalwa Tsama Gom Gyam Khen Rezina, Tati Yimba Mamba Jir Yore, Dina Manchi Shudu Gom Gyam Khen Rezi.
And at the same time, it's not that everybody who lived in a monastery was a meditator either, but in general, there were a great number of meditating practitioners in monasteries.
Tini kashi perna tini ngacho ti Zhongba na la Moshi Sona tini kozola jing Dongban da oda ji yang ji tini gele kashi deng tini yang kashi yoris so lojong chenpo men kan tini yang yoris.
In monasteries too, there were people or monks who didn't have particularly high levels of education or academic attainments, who would perform ritual services for the villagers. For example, when people died.
Within
lay society, traditionally speaking, the number of people who engaged in meditation practice was very, very few.
Ngacho pena tini poku chunta ena tini korang lama tang tapa gomna chokondo mercha pomo gomna chokondo tini musunda was kera chongba gomna chokondo tini kiba gomna choko pomeka gomna choko tini orwo gomna choko re shigbo gomna choko te chu rang thone te khabar remandose.
However, in looking for the reason as to why there was so little lay meditational practice in Tibetan society, we shouldn't try to find the reason in the religious doctrine itself. From the point of view of, from the pure religious point of view in Buddhism, anybody is entitled to practice, whether one is male or female, poor or rich, a lama or a lay person. There is no scriptural or religious limitation on who can take part in meditational practice.
Tini ngacho tini mangsok to so na la tini rune ge chisup shitang ga wang de shina tini mamores ti yege mashin kan yang mambo yores.
Traditionally speaking, in Tibetan society, among the lay population, the standard of education was quite low and illiteracy was widespread.
And
for this reason, giving teachings on rather complicated meditational practices to people in the lay community would be difficult. It would be difficult for people with low levels of education to obtain good understandings of these practices.
Then the ending also Mansoko Latini Pena, Donjito Pena, Ohome, Devacha Gajankam Latini, Kiaga, Ohome, Donji Yorit, Gumji Yorita, and Yota Chimbu Gumjo Marit, Tap de Bunda or the mouth of Batinichi, Gumjava, Munitan Tenichi, Yota Chimbota, Ramban Tombo, Gumjava, Demundu, Yana, the young Kalakansam Gumjava, yours.
In the lay population, there was at least some extent of meditation, rather sort of simplified meditational practices. So meditation on Amitabha that would require the recitation of his name and some simple visualization. But in terms of really complicated, complex, graded visualizations and things like this wasn't prevalent in the lay population. And this is the background of the Tibetan situation, the history of Tibetan. In terms of the work that's being done to spread understanding of meditational practice in lay communities, Khenpo has embarked on this work, and Larunga has embarked on this work now for a period of about 10 years. But the reason that people lay people are taking to these practices in Tibetan society is not to reduce their stress and pressures in everyday life, really, or because of the prevalence of depression or things like this.
Maybe Jimson Karizina, Taron Kozola, to Yopi Satila to your Maris, same good Tonserkana, you gender, so Yopi Satila, Taron Tijan Batila Kozo to your Maris.
And the reason that they're not engaging in meditation for these reasons is because that society has not arrived at the point in Tibet where things like pressure and stress and depression are widespread social phenomena. But the point at which Tibetan society will arrive at a situation where these illnesses and problems become pronounced is when everybody has fancy cars and big houses.
So we're running a little bit late because translation is, as I say, a contemplative way of listening to a lecture. Since you have a lot of time to not actually be listening to anything. So, but we have time for a few questions from the audience. If anybody has a question for Khenpo.
It was mentioned that to attain enlightenment, it would be necessary to have a teacher. According to my understanding, I could be wrong, the Buddha himself attained enlightenment, or a state of enlightenment, that none of his contemporaries had done. So if the Buddha could do it on his own, could not one of us do it as well?
The
question was basically, given that the Buddha himself...
Yes, a good question.
Yeah.
However, it's not. Yes, we can't say that the Buddha did not have a teacher. If you were at the level of the Buddha when he existed in India at that particular time, then yes, perhaps you wouldn't need a teacher. It's like being a PhD student in your final stages. At this point, you probably don't need much instruction from your teacher. However, until one reaches that highly advanced stage, one needs teachers to assist them in the stages up until that point.
if you have a teacher, this is another similar question. If you have a teacher that you establish a relationship with, and they leave the body and they die, is it possible for that person to guide you after they've left their body while you still have yours?
다 lama jitena lama di tetsa pijesi teni tetsa ni teni tetsa pijesi lama di mutundu di chokutola teni ta chiptop kere
chokutola kare
ta di lama tetsa pijesi lama metsa pijesi oda teni rangni la teni daru mutundu teni chiptop kere
rangni la mutata ya teni shirtang teni lama tena lama ta mandi pi gongni tani korang gom jablugta nyamlin shilugta to chama tani ta yaboz tani lojong shi thsong yo na tani lama den desona tani kyo mares.
In general, if one has thoroughly learned about, the content of meditational practices and the meditational techniques, etc., has learnt these thoroughly and well before the passing of one's teacher, then in general, it's one's in a okay position if one's teacher then passes away.
Tanita perna tani koranga tani gum nyamlin de tetsini de ta 상마 약보지 심해나 때저 럼바 때쯤 돈 번다고 때리서 통요나 뒤 가서 때니 라마 내송나야 때니 라마 내 차리 지수형 거란 거 때니 반선 때니 더 라마가 종니 거란 거 로종식 특진라고 때니 용거래서 럼바 때쯤 돈 보증 있나
If one has reached a relatively high state of practice or realization prior to the passing of one's teacher, then it's possible after the teacher's death that some relationship or some continued instruction and guidance could take place.
문이전에 라마 문이전에 라마 야보더니 차당담바지인 더니 로마양더니 대즈더니 냠린 그 럼바 대좀 돈 번다고 된지지 있나 tani laman de mandeta koranga jongla yo patan de mandela kyaprichiyo mare koranga namina koranga ganteni to toba tsamna gangena koranga teni to chitham kres.
If the teacher in question is a really truly qualified master and the student is similarly quite advanced in one's practice, then actually it doesn't matter whether the teacher is alive or has passed away. Regardless, the teacher will be able to provide guidance to the student.
Teni lama dang loma tanja oina teni korang ni ka teni yer dang ti zhan zi gna ni cha gres 另外一个时空yer dang ti zhan zi gna ni korang chatap gres.
And if the relationship between the teacher and the student is like this, then it's possible for them to meet, as it were, in another realm.
Teni karte loma teni de nyamling ga ramba teni thombo thap mena tombo thom mena teni lama de chari ji siang lama jamba zar go res.
And if a student hasn't reached an advanced stage of practice prior to the passing of their teacher, then after the passing of one's teacher, they would need to then find and rely on another teacher.
Lama jamba zar ni teni monthad ni lojong she go res.
And continue with their study and practice.
I will ask first and then I'll try to translate 아니 맹매의 주로 이해를 제가 받은 거였지. 아니 이와서 남편 리퀘스트에 이 아니 남편 진다 정말 맹매의 주로니까 하나 치 상황 이 담이 나왔습니다. So my first question is what the difference between cultural religion and Buddhism, and then whether Buddhism is a religion or some kind of cultural religion or is a tradition or is a pure science.
Yeah. Teni telan jabken tangbo nge lana nipa de jabken teni lan nipa de jwa nipa ga lan de jwa nipa de kan le na shetang rigni se ya tela teni depi lo ja tham ba na la teni rigni se ji de kan de la se re se ne tim chanyi de nu sho ko teni chanyi ru pa nam ga wang de sina tani sanyin ramra gyata tikchi revji na tani zindogsi korang tingi or rine den tendizere te zelug ramra gyata tikchi revji na tani zindogsi lo jashi thamba na la yeah lo jashi thamba na la.
So over the past 100 years there's been a lot of different definitions of what in fact constitutes culture in the West among social scientists and the humanities. And so there are many different opinions in this regard. There's not one united or singularly agreed upon definition of culture. So in order to answer the question of whether or not Buddhism is a cultural religion or not, we first need to look at what we actually mean by the term culture, and only then can we really interrogate the question of whether it is a cultural religion. So even though there are many different opinions on what culture is, there tends to be a standard approach of classifying religion within the realm of culture. And by this way of classification, the more general category is of culture, and then religion is then a specific category within that. And according to this way of looking at things, there is no such thing as religion without culture, or a non-cultural religion. So even though we often refer to culture and religion separately, in actual fact they belong together. So there is one way of looking at things which would describe religion as being part of a local cultural tradition. So one might talk about the Tibetan religious and cultural tradition, or the Indian religious tradition, or the Chinese religious tradition. So, for example, when Indian artisans create tankas of the Buddha, they render his face in an Indian way. And when Chinese artisans render the Buddha, they do so according to Tang Dynasty conventions, where the Buddha is fat and white and happy and bulbous. Yes. And in the Tibetan, the Samye tradition of Thangka painting, they rendered the figures according to the Tibetan, the highest standard of Tibetan aesthetics of physical form. And these practices or conventions had benefit for people in particular places being able to relate to and adopt these religions.
rete yina teni zavi thola teni to yo mare yagre na da teni boba yina da jana yina da zavi thola teni khabarje yo mare te khabar yo nya mare ma to ba teni boba chishi yagre ga chishi jana ga chishi amar ga chishi teni chijo da teni nang chu mai bare ro res.
However, at its basis, at its crux, there is no such distinction in Buddhism. If we start talking about a Chinese Buddhism or an Indian Buddhism or an American Buddhism, then essentially the idea of Buddhism disintegrates.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so maybe one last question. Maybe we'll just try to diversify the gender, so we'll finish with a female voice.
So let me ask. I will ask in Chinese first and then translate in English. 记得您在台湾讲过说，就是lay practitioner就是居士在家这种，如果9年每天花2个小时非常认真的修持的话，是有可能达到正悟的。因为您已经在北美，我是今年年初您在台湾给一系列演讲当中是听音频的，听到这样子的。那您在北美已经大概旅行大概有1个月了，那就您对北美大陆的观察，你觉得这样的建议要在这个地方做，这个地方需要有什么样子的？Okay, my question is, according to one of Khenpo's lectures in Taiwan, he said for lay practitioner, within 9 years, if they really dedicate to their practice 2 hours a day, and then he guaranteed there is a high possibility for lay practitioners to achieve enlightenment. So it was a big encouragement for all audience. Yeah. And so I asked Khenpo, given the fact that you have been traveling in North America for almost 1 month, and given your observation, and what do you think if you would like to make a similar statement here? Regardless of the year, maybe 11 years, I don't know. What kind of cause and conditions or preparations this society or this culture needs to do for you to give such a statement? Like, for example, like, I don't know, package of, I don't know, manual of practice or like the advisors or teachers, etc. 我刚刚说的是说，那些准备可能包括了需要有什么课程啊、教授啊、师资啊之类的，我不太清楚，所以想要请问。
다들 나솔로 야다 로거다 텐디제 기토 간디레즈나 셔당 긍이 바요 말에 뭐 가시나 티니 또이 티 타니보제고나 티 통통고나라 티니 코랑 것들이 정우즈나 고아 고스톡 야보친도 컨텐디 요레 뭐 가시나 양 랑보 있나요 티니 다롱 티니 티 뭐고 컨텐디 양 요레스 Okay,
so even though Khenpo did say the 8-9 year thing, in actual fact, there is no fixed way of saying these things. For some people, they might obtain great realization in a shorter period of time, whereas others may need a much longer time.
Tending also lobda jimo nani talo jindo na tenim tarshin gare jingdo na tarshin gare jindawo tendiga tankirsu chegona ha jankamures.
So it's very difficult to put it in as easily, quantifiable terms as say how many years it would take you to graduate from an undergraduate university course.
Yeah. Rete ina nga chulu gelur gazikita korang teni ngondro da teni jirne da teni tombanye da so gomtsir go ni lobchen jigore teni ti lobchen to yaboz teni nyamlin shejana parchir lo gelur gateni zikna ne teni jigzogore.
So when Khenpo made the comment about 8 or 9 years, he was referring to the fact that within that time it would be possible to do the ngondro, the preliminary practices, and then shamatha practices, and then meditation on emptiness, and that if one did those practices in a diligent way and obtained the results of those practices as they're intended, then it may be possible to achieve awakening in that time.
Teni lo gyat guteni ziknala teni tets gomjotona nyamnyong te yapo thoyong gare teni shishena teni soso teni 돈 동조한다고 되니 되니 군조와 신조와 동반이가 돈 신조와 된지양 요리 맨날 냠용야 보통 샤샤 요리지.
So within 8 or 9 years of serious and diligent practice, in any case, it would be possible to obtain some meditational experience and realization. Some people may, in fact, realize the nature of emptiness in this time, but in any case, it would be one would be able to generate good meditational experience in this time.
Tendi indi pe na America taun razgina ta shirdangal pan nga chu nyamashiri la leka leate teni lethal landro gungkhang shangban chu ji lethal landro gungkhang ji na ta parchin jamblang la kan la parchin rabun rawore tendi na shirdangal leka ta so teni khom ta non shikta teni mambu yore ta yena teni nga chu nga ro ta gongmo ta te sola teni gum jamni teni sona pe na America ta wa na te jabore ti gun jamna japtham kres.
And so the comments that Khenpo made in Hong Kong probably, apply to the American context as well, where the conditions or the circumstances of people who have to hold down everyday jobs in America, their limitations of their time is probably similar to the situation elsewhere. But if they were able to meditate in the morning and meditate in the evening and be diligent in their practice, then probably the results they could obtain would be exactly the same.
Should we ask him about Australians? Okay. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for staying with us, and we hope you enjoyed today. So let's express our appreciation.